guest is Valerie Hannon, Director of Board Innovation Unit in UK. So please, Valerie, stage is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for this invitation. I'm delighted to be able to accept it. I think that the title of your hearing today, New Landscapes of Learning, is a really exciting and appropriate one. But to think about a landscape, you need to stand back a bit. You need to ensure that you are in a position to see the big picture. And so I'm not going to start with discussion about digital technology, or indeed to talk about technology very much at all. I'm going to invite you to think about some of the big questions which I believe we need to be asking if we can be confident that we are setting the right direction for education for today's youth. And I do so from the perspective of someone who works with education systems across the world. The point I want to make, I think, is that the questions which are confronting us are becoming universal globally. Universal and global in the sense of whether you are in a developing, emergent economy or an old, rich, developed economy. For all societies, learning and the knowledge that emerges from high-level education systems is critical to the success of their countries and for their societies. So these questions are fundamental to the future of us all. And the contention I want to make to you is that fundamental change is needed. Okay, thank you very much. And is on his way, in a sense, whether we like it or not. But it will be up to us to shape that change. And the case I want to make is that there are a number of drivers of innovation in education which are fundamentally important and affecting many, many systems. Think of the organised learning systems, schooling systems. I'm going to distinguish here between schooling and learning because they're not the same thing, as having been established pretty much in the 19th century. And thank you, Peter, for giving that history of Sweden, because that sets a fantastic context for this discussion. What you showed was that the schooling system fundamentally is that which was established in the 19th century. It is, in most countries still, fundamentally a factory-based system, where batches of students come in batches of 30, or 20, arranged by their age, and they move through together in batches. They do not have a personalised experience, or very few do, and they are subject to national standardisation. Those 19th century systems have shifted in almost every other aspect of our life, but not in education. Education is one of the most resilient systems, even more so, I would suggest, than the health system. And it is an interesting question as to why. We might come back to that in the discussion. But now, in the 21st century, those 19th century systems are under stress. And some of the factors are as follows. Globalization, which I want to say a bit about. Demography. A distressed environment. New technologies, of which I will not speak, but others will in great depth. And world recession, or at least world financial crisis and turbulence. And together these are bearing down, as it were, on organised learning and creating a different kind of landscape. So when we talk about new landscapes of learning, we need to be thinking way beyond the schooling system which was established back in the 19th century. Let me deal with just a few of those pressures. In 20 minutes I don't have time to talk about them all. But the first I will talk about is globalisation. And I think that a number of people in education don't imagine that globalization has much to do with them. When they think of what it means, they think perhaps of global brands, of container ships, making worldwide markets accessible to all producers. But what's that got to do with our schooling systems? Well, I would argue a great deal. And the first thing to note, of course, is that you have already mentioned PISA. And PISA, in a sense, is the beginnings of a globalized standardization mechanism for education systems. For the first time, education systems measure themselves against each other. It is a form of globalization. For good or for ill is an interesting question, and we may come back to that question. But globalization means much more than that. We have integrated world markets through IT and containerization, which means lower cost producers are working the world markets and can change their centers for production across the world in a blink of an eyelid. So jobs can move in the blink of an eye as well. And this means that workforces in countries are increasingly vulnerable to emerging markets who perhaps are producing lower charging workforces with equally high or even higher skills. Consumers and researchers look across the world for the best. And almost all research teams now are global. It is very rare to find cutting-edge research which is not done on the basis of global collaboration. Higher order skills, therefore, are at a premium. That is what all education systems now need to aim at. And education itself is globalizing. Students are mobile. They look across the world for the most cost-effective and higher rated research organizations. Distance and online learning, of course, becoming increasingly common, and competition between providers. And I will say nothing of how MOOCs, massive online open courses, are now creating a globalized market for collaborative higher education institutions. So we have a globalized education service increasingly in front of us. I would argue that paradoxically, my final point here, understanding one's identity, one's history, and one's core values and cultural practices actually becomes even more important than ever in such a globalized context. My next driver for innovation in education is demographics. And the face in front of you is of Cruz Hernandez, who, when she died at around about 114, was thought to be the oldest woman in the world. As a centenarian, she was quite rare, but in our century, becoming 100 will not be so rare. In the UK, I don't know the statistics for Sweden, they're probably even better, but in the UK, 25% of today's 16-year-olds will live to be over 100. We know that we have aging populations. We know that the consequences of that are very significant. For a start, people will be working a lot longer. In the 20th century, where one might have had a single career path, perhaps, and mastery of one field, in the 21st century, we already know that you are likely to have 10, 15, maybe 20 jobs, but you will need breadth and increasingly depth in several fields, relearning new skills and new fields which perhaps haven't even yet been identified. Why do I say all this? It is because what it means for education or for learning is that we must create lifelong learners from our schools. It is no good for anyone emerging from education today to think that they are finished with learning, with a degree or a postgraduate degree. No, they must continue learning forever because they will need to be working much, much longer. We will all means that we are no longer thinking of education ever ending. We all need to be lifelong learners, and this is a very big shift. In the developing world, the demography is exactly the opposite. You have huge youth bulges in Africa and India and parts of Asia, not China, of course, for obvious reasons. The implication of that is that many of these developing countries cannot even think about creating or recreating the same kind of schooling systems that we did in the 19th century. They are looking for innovative solutions, and I'm sure Mark will be talking about that with some of the work that he's been doing in developing countries in UNESCO. They are looking to leapfrog the old schoolhouse idea and use mobile technologies, use different kinds of forms of transmission of knowledge and of learning so that they don't recreate a 19th century model. They will never otherwise be able to educate their huge youth populations. And this, therefore, is a really interesting driver for innovation. The third of the pressures for innovation that I'm going to talk about is a distressed environment. And you may think, again, that the connection is slight, but I would argue that it is fundamental. Because if we do not, as educators, ask ourselves the question, what kind of young people are we trying to create? I don't think we have a clear set of principles on which to innovate our education systems. What kind of people are we trying to create? And to answer that question, it seems to me, you need to bring into focus our distressed environment. We are becoming urban. For the first time in our history as a species, we are an urban animal. More people live in cities than they do in the land. And we don't know how to make that sustainable. We are seeing more and more extreme weather events which lead to things like the recent hurricanes, this with Katrina, and also to cities like Sydney, threatened by wildfires which come to its very borders. Our planet is under stress, and our young people feel very passionately about this. But in very few parts of the education service are they invited to think about how they become enabled and empowered with the skills and the knowledge to save that planet. This is not an argument about having a few modules in geography about environmental science. It is an argument for the very purposes that we offer young people for their lives, the values, if you like, of the education system. And if I'm talking about what kind of people we are trying to create, then we need to have in focus some issues about our future. I've already mentioned one, our planet under severe existential threat. My best book of 2013 was Al Gore's book on the future. And in that, he tries to, with extraordinary skill and huge research resources, talk about some of the features which characterize this new century. He adds to the drivers which I identified two more. He says, the emergence of rapid, unsustainable growth, populations in cities and in resource consumption. And secondly, the emergence not just of digital technologies with which we are concerned today, but of revolutionary sets of biological, biochemical, genetic and material science technologies that are enabling us to reconstitute the molecular design of all solid matter and, think about this, seize active control over evolution. Seize active control over evolution. That is where our technologies are taking us. And I don't know about you, but that makes me think very hard about the skills and the values of the young people in our education system today. And makes me ask the question, what kinds of experiences, skills, values, and knowledge base will enable young people to deal with those challenges? Al Gore argues that there's a consensus amongst thinkers on these questions. The future now emerging will be extremely different from anything we have ever known. It's a difference not of degree, but of kind. So taken together, my argument in talking about the landscape, the new landscape of learning, is that these drivers point to a transformation in learning and not just improving the system that we currently have. Think about it, if you will, as a kind of split screen. Any manager is familiar with the idea of having a split screen on her desk. On the one hand, on one screen, sure, we need to improve the schools that we've got. We need to ensure that our schools are enabling our young people to acquire the basic skills of literacy and numeracy and so forth. Improve those schools by all means. But on a second screen, we need to be creating innovation which is much more radical. Creating the spaces for educators who understand these challenges, who can work with the exciting new technologies to create completely different ways of learning for young people. And those kinds of innovations will involve a very different use of time, a very different use of space, different players in the whole process of learning. So of course it will involve schools, But in my view, it needs to involve edutech entrepreneurs, businesses, creative and cultural organizations, including the arts, in ways which we do only at the margins right now. So a much more integrated, much greater community approach to the education of our young people seems to me to be absolutely vital. My argument here, therefore, is, sure, let's improve our current systems, but at the same time, we absolutely must have fundamental innovation for the reasons that I've just suggested. Because the world of learning is exploding. Everywhere you look, you are seeing new opportunities, open channels for the distribution of knowledge which cannot be overcome. Some of those titles on that Wordle remind you of that new landscape of learning which has exploded in just the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. So I'm going to leave you with this question as my time is up. Are schools immune from what has been called the wave of disintermediation? You may not know that word, but it means disintermediating from the middleman, as in banking, as in selling your house, as in booking a holiday. The person who was in the middle, your intermediary, has been wiped out. How long are schools going to be essential to young people's learning? Can they remain relevant if their roles and their methods don't evolve radically? And do we all believe that schools should survive because of wider considerations? Actually, I do. I leave you with the thought that I believe them to be vital for social cohesion. But at the moment, they are not changing their roles and their processes radically enough, in my view, to keep up with this new landscape of learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valerie. Saving questions for the panel. Thank you. Yes, take a seat, and we ask Mark.